Welcome back. Let's look at the role of shared vision in teams. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones. They both launched onto the major international scene at about the same time, in the early to mid-60s. I remember the Beatles launched onto the scene, aside from their Hamburg experience, but with their national tour in the U.S. in 1964. They were the Pretty Boys. Even though we thought at the time they had long hair, but now we realize it was fairly short and well kept. They were more attractive. They sang about, "Does she love you? I want to hold your hand," and all these great aspirational moments. And yet the Beatles lasted 6 more years. They were not a sustainable team. They had a great impact on music and on many of our lives, but they now were not very sustainable. Meanwhile, the Rolling Stones, who hit the international scene around the same time, were straggly, and nobody thought they would make it more than a few years or even live that long. They're playing now 50 years later and still going strong. What makes one of these bands more sustainable than the other? If you go back in their histories, the Beatles started, it is said from their autobiographies and biographies written about them, and a lot of interviews at the time, that John and Paul, the two dominant leaders of the Beatles, started by saying, let's create new music. That was their shared vision. The Rolling Stones started with the desire to play music together. As a matter of fact, the first 4 or 5 of their albums were covers. They were playing somebody else's music. The first time the Rolling Stones decided to write their own music happened actually after John Lennon and Paul McCartney were in the studio during one of the Rolling Stones taping sessions, sat in a corner, wrote them a song, gave it to them, and the Rolling Stones looked at each other and said, holy blankety blank blank, this is easy, we should write our own music. These two visions had dramatic impact on them. In the Beatles' system, multiple levels, Brian Epstein, who was their business manager, their general manager, and their emotional glue, was a profound effect at keeping them together. But he died in 1967. And the group started to show strains. Paul wanted his then father-in-law to take over the finances. The others wanted Aaron Klein to take a role in managing the finances. And then some other things started to happen. 2 years after they launched onto the international scene, by 1966, the Beatles decided not to do any more tours. They would do only work in the studio. And the studio became sacred space. The only people allowed in it were musicians, and at the time, they were all men. Well, as their lives evolved, John Lennon broke both of those tenets by bringing Yoko Ono into the studio. And at that time, John Lennon and Yoko Ono were very interested in having their music serve a social activism purpose. Meanwhile, Paul McCartney was interested in writing a symphony, and George Harrison was looking at some other new kinds of music. And you could start to see things break up. By the time they produced the 1968 White Album, I think none of the songs in that album were recorded by all of them being in the studio at the same time. They recorded pieces and mixed them later. And during that time, it is rumored from their interviews that Yoko Ono used to sit in the studio sessions and not only be there, but speak up and give them kind of comments and critiques. By 1970, the Beatles were no longer together. And then, of course, now, unfortunately, they can no longer ever be together. Meanwhile, the Rolling Stones had some rough spots too, but the biggest threat was when Mick Jagger went and did a couple solo albums. The rest of the musicians felt betrayed, because remember, their vision was to play music together. But they had a certain stability, and in the early 70s, Ronnie Wood joins the bands, and he became an emotional glue on stage. But Andrew Oldham stayed as their manager for many, many years. Ahmet Erdogan stayed their producer for many years. Their sponsors, their families were relatively more stable. And like I said, 50 years later, the Rolling Stones are still playing. And they again have said in interviews, they might fight like cats and dogs off stage, but when they get on stage, it's the music. That is an example of these multiple levels working either together or pulling apart a team, in this case, a band. The same thing happens in our families, in our work organizations, in our communities. Same thing happens in our countries. I would like to now segue a bit back to one of the other elements that I had mentioned on the chart, which is not only do these resonant relationships make a difference across the levels, but so do social identity groups. What is a social identity group? Quite technically, it is a group from which you draw part of your identity. So you say, I like to belong to this group. We have a lot of them. In the late 1960s, a group was formed that were the fan clubs of the Star Trek show. The original Star Trek show lasted what we would now call 2 or half seasons, went off the air, and the producers and studio officials were not going to do anything else. The Trekkers, as they call themselves, other people might refer to them as Trekkies, started meeting and started forming these fan clubs, and then they started to come together in a convention. They would dress up and they would reenact scenes. And within a few years, they approached the producers and the creator, Gene Roddenberry, and said, please bring it back. They changed the studio and the creators and the producers' opinions. And of course, now we have 13 full-length feature movies, 5 syndicated primetime shows, 2 or 3 syndicated cartoon series, and billions of dollars in merchandise later. And all of that started because a group of people had a shared interest. And when you look at interviews of the Star Trek fan clubs and the conventions, whether in the US or in Italy or Germany or Brazil or Australia or France, people talk about coming together to be themselves, to reenact moments in a world when there was no wars except for Romulans, and nobody really knows who Romulans are. And because Star Trek created an image of a better world, a place where no one had gone before, a place where people of different nationalities and dispositions and religious preferences were all on the bridge at the same time. And even by the time the Next Generation came along, Star Trek Next Generation, they had a different species, a Klingon military officer. It represented something that people aspire to and find comfort with. That's what social identity groups do to us. Now, another comparison of a more organizational nature would be Apple versus Sony. Apple has been a phenomenal innovator, and people who have iPhones say, hey, I have an iPhone. I have an iPad. I mean, how many people hold up their Samsung phone and say, oh, I'm a Samsung user, or I have an HP tablet? They don't. Sony, which started a lot of these, I remember listening to the first Walkman in 1980, kind of lost that entire market. And even with televisions, I enjoy the Sony television, but many people have more than one television in their homes, don't often have the same brands. So the degree of brand loyalty is very different. And yet, very few people who buy an iPod, an iPhone, an iPad, a Mac don't take advantage of buying more of the products of Apple. Why? Because Apple very, very astutely made it fun to be an Apple user. And now with all the other ancillary, Apple TV, Apple iGrill, and all these other apps and applications, we find ourselves creating a community. That's the power of social identity groups. For the action learning assignment from this module, I'd like you to go back to the multiple levels and spend some more time filling that out and thinking about it, thinking about the quality of the relationships in the different levels in your life system. And I would like you to reflect on the social identity groups in your life. Could be a church, temple, or mosque group. It could be a professional association. It could be a study group. It could be a group of people that share the same hobby or interest. Sometimes it's sports fans of a particular team, members of a particular neighborhood. There are a lot of different social identity groups. So for the action learning assignment, I would like you to identify the social identity groups in your life and to then write in the extent to which these social identity groups are positive emotional attractors. That's what they invoke in you, or negative. Does that social identity group invoke fear? Because there are social identity groups that are negative. Or does it invoke hope? Does it make you have positive feelings or negative defensive feelings? And as you reflect on it, you start to get a bigger picture of the life system surrounding you. Because for us to approach sustained desired change, even as an individual, we have to work at multiple levels in our system. For you as a director of an organization to affect change in the organization, you have to work at the individual level, the dyads, the teams, the organization, and even the community. And that's very hard because it calls for not just complex thinking and planning, it's a lot of extra work. In the next module, we'll be looking at the rest of the stages of intentional change theory and explore how do people effectively move through some of the other stages that we haven't talked about. Thank you.